Chapter 5, Coming Home. Shortly after New Year's Day in 1932, the news of a lieutenant's fatal car crash created a commotion at the Presidio in San Francisco. Lieutenant William J. French was found on a desolate road near Gilroy, California, with his pistol nearby and a bullet wound to his head. The police ruled that his death was a suicide. But military personnel were far more startled by another revelation. An article on the front page of the New York Times, "Army Man Suicide Reveals He is Negro," reported that French had spent 18 years masquerading as a white man. After his death, French's mother disclosed her son's racial identity, but she would neither comment on when her son decided to pass as white nor reveal any other details about his life. The Times noted that French visited his mother in Pasadena at Christmas and that scores of Negroes in that city knew that French was passing as white. The Times reported that French gave the Army 18 years of brilliant service and distinguished himself during World War I as a commissioned officer who led white troops. French's relatives cautioned him against advancing too far in the military, and they tried to convince him that commanding white men was too risky. French chose not to heed these warnings. Maybe he had not expected to advance as quickly and as far as he did, and once the Army granted him the commission, perhaps he simply could not walk away from it. Maybe French worried that to decline such a promotion would arouse suspicions and attract unwanted attention. The last person to see French alive, Mrs. Gertrude McEnroe, was in the car with French at the time of the crash and claimed that French tried to kill her. McEnroe survived and later told officials that French had been on the verge of a nervous breakdown. It was McEnroe's opinion that French was driven to a state of insanity after years of fear and foreboding that his racial identity would be exposed. Lieutenant William J. French's successful military career and untimely death lay bare the tragic consequences of passing. But unlike most blacks who chose to pass permanently, French maintained a relationship with his mother. His visits to her house at Christmas were fraught with danger, yet still he went. Perhaps as a result of those yearly visits, other blacks in Pasadena learned that French was passing as white. French must have been in contact with the relatives who were uneasy about his strivings, who worried that he was too ambitious, and who urged him not to attempt to carry his pose all the way to commanding white troops. French lived a life in the liminal space between the very separate worlds of black and white. Perhaps French was sustained by his Christmas-time visits with his mother and his relationships with relatives and other blacks in Pasadena. Not one family member or friend broke the promise to protect his identity. But at some point, those promises were not enough. If McEnroe was right, French longed for more than military honors and Christmas holidays in Pasadena. No one will ever know exactly what happened in the car on January 3, 1932, before it careened and crashed into a tree near Gilroy, California. No one will ever know the nature of the relationship between Mrs. Gertrude McEnroe and French, who was married to a white woman. Newspaper accounts do not explain why a truck driver stopped and rescued McEnroe from the wreck, but left French in the car. Reports about the case do not provide any answers to the question of why French allegedly tried to kill McEnroe. French's family members were uniformly silent about his personal life, his decision to pass, or any efforts that he made to bond his fractured identity into a more complete and satisfying whole. Without the silence of scores of other Negroes, French's masquerade could have been foiled at any moment. But if McEnroe's assertion is correct, that French's secret drove him to an acute state of mental collapse and the desperate decision to take his own life, then the devastating and even deadly consequences of passing come into sharper view. By the 1940s, the world of Jim Crow that had enveloped French was giving way to a new era with new possibilities. Less than 10 years after French's suicide, Dr. Albert Johnston, a well-respected radiologist in Keene, New Hampshire, received notice of his acceptance as a lieutenant commander in the Medical Corps of the U.S. Navy. 1 year earlier, Johnston had been rejected due to physical defects. He was both overweight and slightly under the minimum height requirement to be granted a position as a commissioned officer. But a dire need for more physicians, and especially radiologists, compelled the Navy to relax its standards and to reconsider applicants previously rejected for organic defects that would not interfere with the performance of their duties. The Navy reversed its prior decision and assigned Johnston to a Naval Medical Specialist unit. Unlike the case of Lieutenant French, the Navy discovered Johnston's secret long before Johnston received his naval uniform. Only a few weeks after the letter of acceptance arrived, a naval intelligence officer visited Johnston at his home. During a short interview, the officer stated bluntly, "We understand that even though you are registered as white, you have colored blood in your veins." A naval background check uncovered that Johnston belonged to a black fraternity while he was in medical school. Johnston responded, "Who knows what blood any of us has in his veins?" A few weeks later, Johnston was informed that his post had been denied because of his inability to meet naval physical requirements. Unsettled by the Navy's discovery, Johnston carefully guarded his secret from his neighbors, friends, patients, and even his children. 6 years later, however, the Johnstons told their children. In 1947, the family's story appeared in the popular periodical Reader's Digest. The Johnstons had come clean, the family had black ancestry and had been passing as white for nearly 20 years. The years between the suicide of Lieutenant William J. French in 1932 and the exposure of the Johnston family's racial identity in 1947 mark a critical turning point in the history of passing. By the late 1940s, many African Americans who had previously passed as white declared that they could no longer endure the emotional turmoil experienced by French and others. In the black press, testimonials of light-skinned blacks registered a palpable sense of relief that accompanied the disavowal of passing and a return to the race. Passing passes out, a 1952 article in Jet magazine proclaimed, as a rearticulation of race consciousness emerged and joined hands with the civil rights movement. These reports in the black press suggested that, similar to the Reconstruction era that followed the Civil War, America had been made anew in the aftermath of World War II. The racial dynamics of this period might allow one to live as black and be a citizen at the same time. Passing had been one of a limited number of strategies that opened doors for African Americans to participate more fully in American life. Perhaps in post-war America, passing would pass out and no longer be necessary, especially if post-war economic prosperity extended to African Americans. Perhaps light-skinned African Americans could claim a black identity and step out from the dark shadows that descended upon Lieutenant William J. French. World War II and its immediate aftermath led mid-century Americans to reconsider the nation's democratic principles against the backdrop of unprecedented political, social, economic, and ideological changes. By the 1950s, the number of lynchings had decreased from hundreds to less than 5. President Harry Truman had issued executive orders to desegregate the military and the federal civil service, and scientists jettisoned the belief that racial differences were based in biology, as the horrors of the Holocaust discredited assumptions about inherent racial inferiority. Even though the naval intelligence officer who interrogated Dr. Johnston in 1941 relied on an assumption that race was an invisible yet enduring essence that inhered in the blood, this logic was becoming outdated. During the 1940s, police forces, juries, baseball teams, public universities, and public accommodations were desegregated. The black newspaper The Pittsburgh Courier announced a double V campaign in 1941 that called for simultaneous victories against fascism abroad and racism at home. This campaign reflected a growing militancy among African Americans who believed that the valiant and willing military service of African American men entitled them to the guarantee of civil rights. A series of landmark Supreme Court cases opened primary elections to voters of all races, Smith v. Allwright in 1944, and declared racially restrictive covenants unenforceable, Shelley v. Kramer in 1948. In 1954, the court ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional, Brown v. Board of Education. Between 1940 and 1956, black voting registration in the South increased by an astounding 624.5%. In the social sciences, Gunnar Myrdal's watershed 1,500-page sociological work, An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem and Modern Democracy, published in 1944, held that if white Americans would live up to the American creed liberty, equality, justice, and fair treatment for all, black Americans would enjoy fuller and more meaningful inclusion in the nation. Myrdal's work underscored the ideals of racial liberalism that emerged in the late 1940s. Racial liberalism coalesced around the New Deal belief that government intervention could ameliorate racial discrimination, that interracial contact was the antidote to individual prejudice, and that in the midst of the battle to win hearts and minds during the Cold War, it was in the national interest of the United States to portray itself as a racially progressive nation. The interplay of social science research, federal action, civil rights pressure, and international scrutiny assured the vitality of civil rights as a national issue. There was good reason for African Americans to feel particularly hopeful about the economic opportunities created by World War II. The 1940s marked the 20th century's most economically equitable decade. The demographic forces of migration and urbanization that occurred during the Jim Crow years consolidated black voting strength in the North and produced an embryonic black middle class that attained higher levels of income and education than an earlier generation could have imagined. Economic inequality declined as the federal government created millions of jobs in the war industries and supported the growth of trade unionism. By the end of the 1940s, African American income equaled 60% of white income. It had been only 40% at the beginning of the decade. In Michigan and other highly unionized states that housed heavy industries, black income reached 90% of white income. In short, it was a season of hope. With African Americans once again taking their seats in Congress and on the federal judiciary, challenging racial mores, and pressing for more meaningful inclusion in the nation, Blanche Bruce and PBS Pinchback might have recognized this period, aptly called the Second Reconstruction, as remarkably similar to the first. The particular conditions and circumstances of post-war America left many to wonder whether passing was still a necessary practice. Maybe the painful loss of family and the alienation from a community were needless. The confluence of these changes suggested that in the post-war period, passing might no longer be obligatory to secure white-collar work, decent housing, or fair treatment. But even in this season of hope, something was still amiss. The post-war period was rife with contradictions. Mass-marketed magazines including Life, Look, and Ebony worked as the agents of racial liberalism and disseminated photographs of the Johnston family as a symbol of peaceful and successful integration to readers around the country. But a closer look reveals that hospital trustees decided to oust Albert Johnston from his position, belying the magazine's cheerful assertions that once the town learned of the Johnstons' racial identity, there simply wasn't any reaction. Racial liberals cheered the message movies released in the late 1940s that promised to tackle the problem of racism directly for the very first time. But the fractured reception of the 1949 film that presented the Johnstons' tale, Lost Boundaries, revealed national ambivalence and anxiety about the possibility of integration. Although audiences around the country applauded the film for its stirring portrayal of racial inequality, city censors in Atlanta and Memphis banned it. The directors of Lost Boundaries and other message movies, including the passing feature, Pinky, assumed that white actors would evoke more sympathy and draw larger audiences. These casting decisions drew the ire of black critics at a time when Hollywood made little room for black actors except in caricatured and stereotyped roles. Even sanguine news of rising black income and employment rates could not overcome hardened racial prejudice. The racial tumult experienced by many blacks, such as Betty and Donald Howard, ran counter to the ebullience of the post-war period. The Howards moved into Chicago's Trumbull Park homes in 1953 after Chicago Housing Authority officials misrecognized Betty as a white woman. Betty had not the slightest physical characteristics of a Negro, but the arrival of Betty's recognizably black husband, Donald, ignited nearly a decade of racial violence and neighborhood unrest. Mobs numbering in the thousands voiced unequivocal rejection of the idea of integration by breaking the Howards' windows and detonating ear-shattering explosives. Even Ebony, a magazine firmly committed to presenting cheery accounts of black life, could not brighten the Howards' bleak story. A July 1954 article commented on Donald Howard's severe weight loss, his habit of chain smoking, and the terrific psychological toll of the ordeal. Whether or not the practice of passing began to pass out in the post-war period is a subject for debate. The Howards' story, however, belies optimistic pronouncements about the irrelevance of passing and puts in plain view the frightening consequences of racial misrecognition in the post-war period. The events at Trumbull Park bring into focus a set of worrisome factors that challenged post-war commitments to racial liberalism and social inclusivity. Hardened social and economic barriers and the particularly explosive concern of housing left integrationist goals far from realized. The post-1945 world, despite its inconsistencies and paradoxes, was strikingly different than the Jim Crow world that closed in on Lieutenant William J. French in 1932. French was trapped with no way out. But by the 1940s, more African Americans rejected passing and liberated themselves from the fear and anxiety of discovery. Racial discrimination persisted, and so did passing, but the promise of new economic possibilities coupled with a growing protest movement for civil rights led many to reconsider the choices they made about their racial identities. The arc of the Johnston family's story follows this logic precisely. At the beginning of the 1940s, the family was passing as white, but by the end of the decade, they had been exposed, grown tired of the masquerade, and decided to link their fate with other African Americans. By 1949, the family publicly declared that they would never pass again. Their story provides a blueprint to understand the transition from passing to a fuller embrace of black identity. Albert Johnston was born in 1900. He straddled both sides of the color line during his early years. His father, who was lighter than Albert, had been raised on a farm in Michigan and descended from Northerners who had not been slaves. His mother, on the other hand, was from the Deep South. Her parents had been slaves in Mississippi. The family lived in Chicago, and Johnston's father passed as white to work as a real estate agent. The family never invited black guests to their home. Johnston's father feared that the presence of black visitors would compromise his appearance and his employment. Albert Johnston went to public school in Chicago during the years before the Great Migration, when the schools were not segregated and only a few thousand African Americans lived in the city. When Albert attended Wendell Phillips High School, a school that would become predominantly black by the 1920s, all of his friends were white, and he remembered only one black student in his graduating class. Johnston's wife, Thyra Bauman, was born in 1903 in New Orleans. Her grandfather was a white man from Germany who married a black woman and served as the shipping commissioner of the Port of New Orleans. Thyra's father worked as a clerk in the post office at a time when the city was almost entirely segregated with the exception of federal offices. The presidential election of 1912 would change the course of the Bauman family's life. Unusually large numbers of African Americans broke with the party of Lincoln and cast ballots for the Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson. During the campaign, Wilson assured African Americans that he would advocate for racial justice and fairness. But once in the White House in 1913, Wilson dismissed 15 out of 17 black supervisors who held federal jobs. Throughout the country, blacks were segregated or dismissed from federal positions. Postmaster Albert Burleson of Texas made the case for segregation by complaining of intolerable conditions where whites were forced to work with blacks and share the same drinking glasses, towels, and toilets. White women recoiled at the affront of taking dictation from drunken, greasy, and ill-smelling Negroes. The head of the Internal Revenue System in Georgia stated, "There are no government positions for the Negro in the South. They are to be in the cornfield." President Wilson voiced no objections to segregation. In fact, he hoped that racial separation would help to reduce friction in federal departments. Thyra's father quickly took notice of the pattern and the spread of segregation. He applied to transfer to the Boston post office. He hoped that in the North, he might find the just racial conditions that Wilson had promised in 1912 and thwarted only 1 year later in 1913. The Baumans passed as white, but unlike the Johnstons, they socialized with Boston's small community of black lawyers, doctors, dentists, and other professionals. Thyra took a job as a stenographer at the Mellons Food Company and put white on her application. Her white skin, light brown hair, and blue eyes made it easy for her to pass. When she applied for her next job, she followed her mother's instructions to leave the race part of the application blank and to let them fill it out. But in her new position, being white was not enough. The company had a policy of refusing employment to Catholics. To secure the job, Thyra passed as both white and Protestant. Thyra's father was very particular about the man who dated his daughter. Being seen with a black man might cost Thyra her job. And even worse, marrying a black man was going back to the segregated life that Thyra's father had eagerly left behind in New Orleans. When the handsome black halfback on Brown University's football team invited Thyra to attend the Harvard-Brown football game, Thyra's father forced her to decline. When the young man wrote love letters to Thyra, her parents hid them from her. A broken-hearted Thyra wondered why she never heard from him again. In 1923, Thyra spent 2 weeks in Chicago going on dates with the city's most eligible black bachelors, including Albert Johnston, a medical student at the University of Chicago. Albert was slightly darker than Thyra, but he could easily pass, and he did so to buy orchestra seats to see the Duncan sisters perform their signature roles in Topsy and Eva, a musical comedy derived from Harriet Beecher Stowe's classic, Uncle Tom's Cabin. One can only imagine how Albert and Thyra felt that evening, passing as white, taking their seats, the best seats in the house, to watch one of the most popular vaudeville duos in America. One can only wonder how they felt when Rosetta Duncan took the stage as Topsy in the most grotesque form of blackface and racial caricature. Indeed, in a review of Topsy and Eva, the Sunday Advertiser wrote, "When it comes to blackface art, the palm of accomplishment goes not, as you might suggest in the first 3 guesses, to Al Jolson, but to little Rosetta Duncan, co-star with her sister, Vivian. When it comes to applying the liquid burnt cork, she outdoes Jolson in every known direction. Rosetta Duncan outperformed Jolson largely because she almost bathes in the ebony fluid," the reviewer explained. "She was practically immersed in color, with only a narrow strip. Minus makeup. Her hair was clumped in unkempt and unruly braids, sprouting from her head in every direction." Sitting in the most comfortable seats in the theater, Albert and Thyra were far removed from the crowded balcony pejoratively known as the Nigger Heaven, which was the only place for black viewers. It would not have come as a surprise to Albert or Thyra to see Rosetta Duncan go to the limit in makeup in this part. Topsy and Eva was widely popular. It ran for 47 weeks in Chicago. Albert and Thyra knew what to expect. In this farce, Topsy appeared on the auction block and laughed heartily when no one would buy her because, as the auctioneer explained, didn't nobody want poor Topsy, not even for a dime, a nickel or a cent. When Eva asked, "Isn't it beautiful?" or when Topsy crossed her eyes, stood on her head, and turned cartwheels to Eva's delight, Albert and Thyra may have felt ill at ease. Or maybe they enjoyed the performance. This couple, scions of Chicago's and Boston's light-skinned black elite, may have felt no kinship with Topsy, the incorrigible child and the laughingstock of the play. Maybe they had learned their roles so well that they knew when to laugh along with the white theatergoers who surrounded them in the orchestra. Even if Albert and Thyra found Topsy and Eva unbearable to watch, they certainly could not let it show. Loss was a prerequisite of passing. But the losses that passing demanded were not all the same for those who passed. Passing could mean the wrenching loss of one's family, but it could also mean the personal pain of losing one's dignity. It could mean laughing on cue at a minstrel show or constraining one's feelings and emotions and being unable to register disgust or outrage at a racist joke. For some, this was undoubtedly a bitter bargain. But for others, the connection with oneself and one's past had been lost long ago. Watching the spectacle of Rosetta Duncan playing the fool while drenched in ebony fluid may have meant little or nothing at all to this young couple. A few days before they went to see Topsy and Eva, Albert proposed to Thyra at his fraternity house. Thyra was elated. Her parents were terrified. This love affair had transpired entirely while Thyra was in Chicago and far away from her family who lived in Boston. Thyra's parents desperately needed to know what this young medical student looked like. To their great relief, he was light enough to pass, and he was a member of the right social circle. Thyra and Albert were married on Christmas Day in 1924. During his college years at the University of Chicago, Albert Johnston was not invited to the white social events, but he had a close group of black friends, and he was an active member of the black fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi. Rush Medical College had a quota for black students. Johnston was one of two who were admitted. Neither Johnston nor the other black student was required to serve as junior intern at Presbyterian Hospital in Chicago because the administrators knew that the white patients would object. But before graduation, Johnston needed an internship at a prestigious hospital. Only 4 black hospitals accepted interns, and not one of these hospitals was acceptable to Rush. Johnston approached hospitals in liberal areas of the country in the hopes that he might be given a chance. He almost succeeded at Toledo. But once the doctors discovered that Johnston was black during the interview, he was told that it was not their policy to accept colored interns. When Maine General Hospital telegrammed Johnston to express interest and did not ask any questions about race, Johnston kept quiet. He was hired. During his internship, he was feted at the Portland Club, and he danced and played tennis with the other interns. Yet he always worried that his racial background would be discovered. Later, some of the doctors told him, "When you first came, some of us thought you were a Filipino, or maybe Hawaiian or a Jew. We didn't know what you were." If they did not know, he was not going to tell them. After his internship at Maine General, Johnston began a medical practice in Gorham, New Hampshire, a rural hamlet at the base of Mount Washington. In the rolling hills of Gorham, Johnston delivered babies, pulled teeth, set a dog's broken leg, and treated the array of sicknesses and diseases that afflicted Gorham's residents. The quintessential country doctor, Johnston was sometimes paid in cash and sometimes in butter, eggs, or various types of produce. The neighbors were very selective about who could move into the neighborhood. As Johnston explained, only the best people lived there, no Jews or Catholics, for example. The Johnstons appeared white and Protestant, and thereby just right. When Thyra arrived, the women in the town taught her to light the coal stove and encouraged her to enroll the children in the church's cradle class. A Catholic woman from New Orleans would become a devout Congregationalist in New England. At first glance, Gorham seemed calm and idyllic, the perfect home for a young family. But tensions, racial, ethnic, and religious, roiled beneath the peaceful veneer. The older Yankees looked upon the newly arriving French Catholics from Canada with disgust. A Ku Klux Klan clavern was assembling. Albert claimed not to be worried. The Klan, Albert believed, was intolerant of Jews, but they seemed to treat Abe Stahl, the only Jewish resident in Gorham, with respect. Maybe Thyra's southern roots caused her greater alarm. She was particularly concerned about her children and what would happen when they grew up. Albert tried to reassure her by saying, "Let's just saw wood and see what happens." It is hard to believe that Albert was not more distressed, even panicked, as his neighbors and patients formed a clan in the seemingly placid town of Gorham. He must have known that these honest and hard-working folks could turn on him at any minute. He was a black man who was intimately involved in their lives. He delivered their babies, cared for their children, examined their wives, and buried their dead. The Klan, founded in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee, had been dormant since the 1870s, when the federal government launched a series of investigations that led to the passage of the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871 and prosecutions under that law. As Congress listened to the arresting testimony, the federal government discovered what black men and women in the South knew too well: the Klan had terrorized and intimidated African Americans, coerced their economic dependency, and attempted to reinstate the social customs of antebellum America in the name of preserving white supremacy. The Enforcement Acts buttressed the 14th and 15th Amendments by protecting the rights of African Americans to vote, to hold office, to serve on juries, and to receive equal protection under the law. The federal government effectively prosecuted Klan members and disbanded the organization in the 1870s. But in 1915, a second Klan rose, this time on the top of Stone Mountain in Atlanta, Georgia, and found a large and sympathetic base in the Midwest and the Northeast. By the end of the 1920s, the invisible empire was hardly invisible. Membership swelled from 3 million to 8 million, and the organization exerted enough political muscle to control the state legislatures in Colorado and Indiana. Klansmen were elected mayors in Portland, Maine, and Portland, Oregon. Even as a Klan gathered in Gorham, the Johnstons felt safe. They made close friends and became actively involved in the town's civic life. Albert was elected to the school board, the Rotary Club, and the Masonic Lodge. Thyra was selected to be the president of the White Mountain Junior League of the Congregational Church. She served 2 terms as president of the Gorham Women's Club, and she played bridge and hosted parties and teas. But they never relaxed entirely. Their lives seemed anchored in Gorham, but Albert and Thyra decided to rent their house because they feared that their racial identity might be revealed if they decided to buy. If their background were discovered, they reasoned, they would not have the burden of a house to sell. With only a rental agreement, they could leave town on a month's notice, assuming that they would have that much time. When a rambling 3-story house with 17 rooms, 2 parlors, and a reception hall went on the market, the Johnstons took a risk and bought it. The house, shaded by ancient elm trees, sat high on a hill and overlooked all of Gorham. Soon the Johnstons' new home was the social hub of the town. The Congregational Church planted its Christmas tree in the yard and held the annual Christmas social at the house, and the Johnstons entertained Gorham's residents at an elegant New Year's reception. We will never know what the residents of Gorham would have done if they had found out about the Johnstons' racial identity. They never did, despite rumors. There was the day when Albert Jr. teased the family's French-Canadian maid, who responded by calling him a little pickaninny. There was the time when Thyra's father, who looked white, visited Gorham and a man approached him and pointed to Thyra. "See that lady down there?" he asked. "Well, they say she's a real mulattress. But now, funny thing is, her husband's darker and than what she is." Thyra's father insisted that man was mistaken, that lady was his daughter and therefore she was certainly not a real mulattress. The man took Thyra's father's word for it. Thyra and Albert did not know whether to be worried or reassured. The man seemed more curious than hateful. Perhaps this was an encouraging sign of how the other residents might react if the family's racial identity were discovered. Old friends in Boston kept the Johnstons secret, even if they disapproved of the practice of passing. The Johnstons went to Boston for visits, but they never took their children with them. The milieu of Boston's light-skinned black elites would be unfamiliar to the children who lived in an entirely white world. Only the most rare occasions brought the children into contact with black people. A black drifter stayed overnight in the Gorham jail, and Albert Jr., along with the other curious children, went to the jail in the morning to get a glimpse of a black man. Perhaps a black cook or housekeeper might accompany a family who visited Gorham for the summer. With so few blacks in the town, the Johnstons' black friends in Boston understood that they would never be invited to Gorham. Over time, the Johnstons lost those friends. When Dr. Johnston received an offer to take a 1-year postgraduate course at Harvard Medical School, there was no cause for worry. As Thyra explained, "Our colored contacts are mostly weaned away now. And, if I run into any of them on the street when I have the children, well, I can handle that." Only Thyra's mother knew, and they could trust her to keep their secret. The year in Boston passed by without much trouble for Thyra and Albert, but their son Albert Jr. encountered prejudice from those who thought he was Jewish. Because of his darker complexion, he was called a kike. When the family returned to Gorham, Albert Jr. made the honor roll, joined the ski team, played the piano, and was recommended for the prestigious Mount Hermon School in western Massachusetts. At Mount Hermon, Albert Jr. faced anti-Semitism again. He had trouble with a roommate who announced that he hated Jews. The roommate made a habit of asking, "What are you? A kike or a Greek or what? No? Well, I bet you've got some nigger in you." During this time, Albert Jr. did not know that he was black. Perhaps he felt the sting of these slurs and began to see himself through the eyes of others long before his parents told him the truth. Dr. Johnston's postgraduate studies at Harvard created an opportunity at the leading hospital in Keene, New Hampshire. The family was reluctant to leave Gorham, especially when they were beginning to trust their neighbors, but this was a position that Johnston could not refuse. In the fall of 1939, the family moved 160 miles south to a three-story brick house sheltered by majestic elm trees on a large corner lot. Moving to Keene and living among strangers stoked fears about the colored thing, but in Keene as in Gorham, Thyra and Albert became intimately involved in the town's social and civic life. Thyra joined the Ladies' Medical Auxiliary and took part in a variety of civic and volunteer organizations. Class and gender identities remained intact while racial boundaries were crossed. Race and gender are never isolated, disparate, or distinct categories, rather they are always linked, interrelated, and intersectional. Despite their skin color, which was brown enough to cast doubt on their presumed whiteness, the family's presentation of their class and social status enabled their acceptance by Keene's white residents. Albert was an esteemed radiologist, and his wife was the archetypal housewife and mother. Thyra's role in the Johnstons' masquerade was equally, if not more, important than her husband's. White women were ensconced in the home, black women were tethered to the workforce. White women were the homemakers, black women were the housekeepers. Thyra, through her absence from the labor force, her gracious hosting, her efficient homekeeping, her dedication to Keene's civic causes, played the role of an upper-middle-class white woman to the hilt. As one observer noted, the Johnstons enjoyed a lifestyle in Keene that would have been impossible if they had given themselves merely the label Negro. But in the early 1940s, it all came to an abrupt end. Two unrelated events altered the direction of the Johnstons' blissful lives in Keene: an offhand comment made by Albert Jr. and Dr. Johnston's decision to enlist in the Navy. At Mount Hermon, Albert Jr. befriended a popular black student, Charlie Duncan, the son of the actor Todd Duncan, who starred in Porgy and Bess. When Albert Jr. was home from school, he made a careless remark to his parents: "Everyone liked Charlie, even if he was colored." This unthinking praise of his son's only black friend infuriated Dr. Johnston, and at this particular moment, he felt that he could no longer continue the pretense. Albert and Thyra had raised their sons and daughter as white children who rarely even heard the word Negro. Was not Albert Jr. saying what any white man in the early 1940s might say if he formed a new friendship with a black person? Yet something about this comment, or perhaps the cavalier way that Albert Jr. said it, offended Dr. Johnston to the point that he was willing to risk the life that he and Thyra had so carefully constructed over 20 years. Even as his wife cried out to him, "No. No. Don't do it. Don't ever do it." Albert Jr. was preparing to go on a date when he heard his father say, "Well, you're colored." He remembered that a funny sensation ran through his body. He stopped getting dressed. He asked if his mother was colored too, even though he already knew the answer. His mother and father were black, as were his four grandparents, but they all could pass as white. Albert and Thyra explained what passing was, and they assured their son that they were not ashamed of being black, but rather that passing as white was the only way that Dr. Johnston could practice medicine. Now that Albert Jr. knew the family's secret, he would have to keep it. The younger children did not know yet, and if such startling news spread around town, the consequences would be calamitous for Dr. Johnston and his flourishing medical career. Instead of getting ready for his date, Albert Jr. spent the evening learning how, why, and when his family decided to pass. The stories spilled out from his mother and father. They interrupted and talked over each other as one filled in the details that the other had forgotten. From Portland to Gorham to Keene, Albert and Thyra had been stalked by the constant fear that their racial identity would be discovered. They had guarded their secret with great care, and they had made great sacrifices. They lost friends. They fell out of touch with relatives who could not pass. As Albert Jr. recalled, "During all these years my mother and father had a few colored contacts in New York and Boston but never had colored friends as guests. Because of fear of discovery." Dr. Johnston may have remembered that his father, a white real estate agent, would not allow any black guests at his house. Thyra had not been allowed to date any men who looked black. Passing not only required looking white, but also meant keeping one's distance from black people. More puzzling was Dr. Johnston's decision to apply to enlist in the Navy as a medical officer. The Navy urgently needed radiologists, so perhaps Dr. Johnston assumed that the naval standards might be relaxed. Or as Thyra suggested, perhaps the naval intelligence officer had visited their home to make sure that Dr. Johnston did not look really black. Regardless, Dr. Johnston had to know that he would be subjected to an exhaustive investigation. He had lived as a black man while he was in college at the University of Chicago. He must have known that his membership in a black organization, the Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity, would be quickly and easily uncovered, as it was by the naval intelligence officer who visited Johnston at his home in 1941. Perhaps by 1941, Dr. Johnston had grown tired of passing, or he no longer could tolerate attending medical conventions and nodding his assent when his colleagues said that Negroes did not have the brains or the values of white doctors. Perhaps the stress and the sacrifice had become too much to bear, and Albert and Thyra wanted their children to live lives free of the secrets that had beleaguered them. When the younger children were told that they were black, they understood why they had never known their own relatives the way that other children did. They understood why they only knew Aunt Nette, their mother's sister, who looked white, and why their parents whispered when they talked about race relations. Albert Jr. had difficulty in school after he was told, and he tried to find solace by traveling across the country with an old friend from Gorham. He visited many of his black relatives and learned that some blacks lived just like the white families in Gorham and Keene. He also found other relatives who were passing. He planned to visit an aunt and uncle in Los Angeles, but upon his arrival, he discovered that they had divorced. His uncle had gone over to the other side, married a white woman, and was passing permanently. Like the Johnstons, Albert Jr.'s uncle had to sever all ties with his black friends to maintain his new life. Albert Jr.'s aunt was stung by the divorce, but she never betrayed her ex-husband's secret. When she called to tell him that his nephew was in town, he refused to see Albert Jr. He may have felt that he could not trust his ex-wife's word that Albert Jr. was light enough to pass, or he feared that his nephew might expose him before his white wife and white friends. Regardless, Albert Jr. would never meet his uncle. Passing made some relationships impossible. This was one of them. Picturing integration. It is curious why the Johnstons waited 6 years to tell their children about their racial identity. They may have felt that 1947 was a more auspicious time to declare that they had black ancestry than 1941. Given the economic, social, and political changes that occurred in the wake of World War II, the Johnstons may have read the post-war period as a dawn of a new era in race relations. The story spread quickly around town after the Johnstons told their children. In 1947, Reader's Digest published an article about the family, and by 1949 millions of Americans could see photographs of the Johnstons on the pages of mass-marketed magazines like Life, Look, and Ebony. These magazines put passing in the national spotlight and brought it to its largest audience. Life, known as America's favorite magazine, was possibly the most influential American magazine of the 20th century. One study found that half of all Americans older than the age of 10 had seen one or more copies of the magazine in 1950, just a year after Life published the Johnstons' story. In the words of its founder, Henry Luce, Life's mission was to be the show book of the world, to educate and entertain its 20 million primarily white, urban and suburban, middle-class readers by opening a window to see life, to see the world, to eyewitness great events, to watch the faces of the poor and the gestures of the proud. Life's coverage of the Johnstons coupled the magazine's embrace of the nuclear family and post-war domesticity with its commitment to racial liberalism. Life normalized the Johnstons, presenting their story as one of human interest, far removed from the battlegrounds of politics and crises over desegregation. White readers could look and see just how similar the Johnstons were to their own families. The Johnstons' class status and conformity to traditional gender roles and ideals about family values also made them a source of pride for Ebony, whose founder and publisher, John H. Johnson, promised to deliver the happier side of Negro life to its readers and focused its content on black firsts, celebrities, and consumerism. Life and Look acted as the emissaries of racial liberalism and promoted the idea of an integrated society before the fact of one existed, casting the Johnston family and their tolerant neighbors as symbols of the dawn of a new era in American race relations. These magazines proudly announced that the residents of Keene embraced the Johnstons, even though they were a black family who had passed as white. In February 1949, Look reported with delight, the Johnstons, a leading family in Keene, New Hampshire, last spring let the world know that they were Negroes. The reaction? There was none. Look, editor William Houseman described the magazine's investment in depicting peaceful integration and wrote to Albert Johnston Jr. that the most important message of the article was that the Johnstons of Keene, New Hampshire, have passed through such a remarkable experience without altering their lives one single bit. Look presented the Johnstons as ideal neighbors. They were the proprietors of one of the happiest hangouts in the little town of Keene, and, most importantly, the family is one of the most socially accepted and prosperous in the town. Life in Look's splashy photographs of Keene as a newly but peacefully integrated community offered visual certainty of the town's acceptance and featured each family member in a placid interracial setting. Look pictured the Johnstons' daughter, Anne, playing cards encircled by white friends and assured its readers that she is still the most popular girl in her high school class. Ebony showed the Johnstons entertaining European-born guests in their elegant living room, and Life featured Albert Johnston Jr. sharing a room with two white students at the University of New Hampshire. Although most of the photographs featured the Johnstons in social situations, other pictures placed Dr. Johnston in professional settings, supervising other doctors, discussing X-ray film, and treating white patients. The photographs visually corroborated the optimistic text of the articles and gave a national readership a rare first look at the lives of residents of an amicably integrated town. Although the photographs foregrounded the Johnstons, the articles lavished praise on the white residents of Keene for their compassion and open-mindedness. The real heroes were the sympathetic and kind-hearted white friends and neighbors who embraced the Johnstons after discovering their racial ancestry. The article New Hampshire Neighborliness Crosses the Color Line, published in the New Hampshire Sunday News, commended the town's tolerance, transcending racial bias and color lines to accept a Keene family as neighbors, though they have Negro blood. Echoing earlier observations that there was no reaction at all, the articles insisted that race simply did not matter to the kind-hearted folks of Keene. The same article noted that Dr. Johnston's patients trusted him and respected him as a doctor. And that, for Keene, was enough. The local newspaper, the Keene Sentinel, gushed with pride when it described a Sunday morning in which the parishioners invited Dr. Johnston to ring the church bells. The Sentinel described that idyllic moment as symbolic of the world as it should be. The 1949 film Lost Boundaries staged the town's acceptance in similar ways, and newspapers responded with equal praise. The Boston Record found that the unanimously generous, understanding reaction of the neighbors offered the film's viewers profoundly stirring sequences. Reminiscent of Myrdal's attention to what goes on in the minds of white Americans, the authors of these articles underscored the role of liberal whites as agents of change. These articles overstated the impact of integration on whites and presented integration as a generous act of white sacrifice and benevolence. Little if any inquiry was directed toward the attendant effects on blacks. Ebony shifted the focus back to the Johnstons and offered a more cautious analysis of Keene's acceptance of the family. Although featuring a similar collage of interracial photographs, Ebony carefully noted, always accepted and considered white by the community, the Johnstons are now exposed as Negroes, all voluntarily on their part. To date their status in the small town of Keene, New Hampshire is unchanged. Ebony voiced more skepticism about the town's reaction and anticipated that the disclosure of the Johnstons' racial identity would eventually cause trouble for the family. A critical assessment of the reaction of the New Hampshire community led to Ebony's report that proud though they are of Keene's liberality toward Negroes, some residents of the city wonder whether it is because so few colored people live there that acceptance of Negroes is not a problem. Ebony interviewed Felix Eckhart, a white resident of Keene and a friend of the Johnstons, who supported this claim by observing, majority groups in nearly every city are willing to accept members of a minority readily, as long as there are not too many of them to assimilate. Perhaps Keene could accept even this situation, but since it has not come about, there is no sure way to tell. Keene residents had no cause to fear a black invasion. Albert Johnston Jr. counted only 6 black families living among Keene's 13,800 residents. Still, George Miller, one of the few black residents, unequivocally defended Keene's progressive image. Proudly stating that he had never encountered any social or professional discrimination, Miller described Keene as one of the most liberal cities in the world. The limits of racial liberalism. Even in the purportedly progressive town of Keene, racial liberalism proved ambiguous. Although Life, Look, and Ebony circulated the Johnstons' story as an encouraging sign of successful integration, Thyra Johnston recalled that when word got around Keene that the family was black, good friends sent many cards, letters, flowers and called. We weren't quite sure whether they were congratulating us or condoling with us. The media's celebration of the town's neighborliness and wholehearted acceptance of the Johnstons cloaked a fractious political battle that occurred at Elliott Community Hospital. The board of directors tried to oust Johnston from his position shortly after they discovered his racial identity in 1947. After a contentious 6-year battle, the board was successful. On July 5, 1953, the hospital trustees terminated Johnston's contract. Johnston described a most harmonious relationship with the hospital's board of trustees before he revealed his racial background. Indeed, Dr. Johnston offered confirmation of the town's tolerance and declared, "If I wanted to be militant about our family's new status, it would be just like Don Quixote fighting windmills." Over the course of his 13-year career in Keene, he had played a major role in attracting new patients and increasing the yearly income of the radiology department. But, in fact, this friendly relationship soured after the Reader's Digest article was published. In a letter to Louis de Rochemont, the producer of Lost Boundaries, Thyra Johnston spoke candidly about the stink going on among some of the board of directors at the hospital to oust Johnston out of the hospital. Thyra told de Rochemont about an incident in which Johnston confronted a trustee who had the nerve to practically admit it was a color issue, convincing Thyra that the doctors at the hospital would stoop to any means to get him out. Seeing the dispute as one of both race and class, Thyra blamed the malicious jealousy of a small clique known as the Court Street Gang and speculated that things might have been different if she and Dr. Johnston had been friends of theirs or had joined their country club. Thyra remained confident that there are more people in Keene who are not prejudiced, as is this little clique that are trying to instigate trouble for us. After the release of Lost Boundaries drew national attention to the family's story, local branches of the NAACP asked the Johnstons to speak on the subject of integration. These branches saw the Johnstons as uniquely situated to advance a civil rights agenda and to denounce racial inequality. Johnston's earlier rejection from the Navy provided additional fodder for the NAACP. Lillian Jackson, president of the Baltimore branch, asked Johnston to speak about his experiences with the Navy and noted that the day is fast dawning when a man's position in life will not depend upon the color of his skin, but upon his ability alone. Johnston's professional and socio-economic credentials also heightened his appeal. As an upper-middle-class physician, Johnston was well poised to be an NAACP spokesman. The sensationalism of the story attracted large audiences. NAACP members were eager to have a look at the Johnstons and judge their appearance for themselves. If these members subscribed to Ebony, they would have been familiar with articles that played with the curious nature of passing by asking readers to identify which is Negro and which is white, from a collage of photographs of racially ambiguous men and women. Both the NAACP and Ebony relied on the fascination with passing within the black community to sell magazines and to draw large turnouts to the Johnston speaking engagements. While he lived as a white man, Dr. Johnston had fallen silent on issues of race for almost 20 years. When he finally spoke before the Baltimore branch of the NAACP in September of 1949, he had much to say. He offered an especially scathing critique of the failure of the nation to fulfill its promises to blacks. The U.S. stands before the entire world as a hypocrite because of the racial equality it preaches and the arrogant bigoted white racial superiority it practices. Even an imbecile doesn't believe the Tommy rot about racial equality as practiced by the U.S. government. Johnston proposed an aggressive program to improve race relations that emphasized interracial interaction on a social basis. Drawing on his own experiences, he explained that only when one person through intimate social contact understands another, his weaknesses, and virtues, prejudice breaks down. Johnston's speeches coupled messages of race pride with explicit critiques of racial discrimination. Reflecting a nascent racial consciousness and speaking about the resilience of the black community, he identified himself with his audience and expressed pride in our race that has undergone and is undergoing so many humiliations, brutalities, injustices and suppression, but still had the patience and fortitude and still is unequaled in its ability to be happy and joyous in the presence of fear, humiliation and, for most of us, poverty. While Johnston's middle-class upbringing sheltered him from many of the hardships that he described, he spoke candidly about discrimination, noting the irrationality and inexplicability of prejudice during a time when the nation needed the skills of its entire population. Nature does not give talents according to color, and the Lord only knows how many Edisons have spent their life mopping floors because of the lack of opportunity to develop latent talents. No country can present their full strength without using the labor, the genius, and culture of all its people. Johnston ended his speech by linking racial progress with national interests. Echoing the racial rhetoric of the Cold War period, he called for the immediate passage of legislation to abolish this very un-American racial persecution and implored the government not to bow for political expediency to the minority of racial bigots but rather to conscientiously support such vital legislation in the interest of national security. Hitting all the right notes, Johnston connected personally with his audience and made an impassioned plea for the country to live up to its democratic principles. Dr. Johnston also offered a more sobering portrayal of the series of events that led to his dismissal from the hospital to NAACP audiences, and in an article published in the Keene Sentinel. Recanting his previous statement that he would be like Don Quixote tilting at windmills if he said that he had experienced any trouble, as early as November 1949, Johnston stated that he believed that racial discrimination or personal animosity was the underlying motive behind the effort to terminate his contract. Johnston suspected that somebody was knifing him shortly after the information got around that he was a Negro. A chance meeting confirmed Johnston's suspicions when, early in 1949, Johnston was accidentally introduced to the new radiologist who would replace him. Johnston stated that he built the department fivefold in 7 years. "You can imagine my shock," Johnston told the Keene Sentinel. "I had been in Keene since 1940 and I had built up the department considerably. I was on the best terms with everyone and had no idea what was being planned. It was all done very quietly." The hospital trustees denied Johnston's allegations and argued that he had neglected his duties at the hospital by opening a private practice. Johnston offered a different explanation. In June 1949, his decision to open a private office was for self-protection, for the time when they might pull the rug out from under me. The debate continued, and in a front-page article of the Keene Sentinel on June 12, 1953, hospital official Charles Kingsbury denied that Johnston's dismissal was related to his race. Johnston countered Kingsbury's argument and stated that he has no doubt he was fired because he is a Negro. After his dismissal, Johnston continued a successful private practice in Keene until 1966, when he and Thyra left Keene and retired in Hawaii. Passing goes to Hollywood. If Life, Look, and Ebony magazines gave Passing its largest readership with splashy photographs and optimistic prose, the silver screen brought these pictures and stories to life, making the agony of those who pass palpable, even heartrending to national audiences. Although some moviegoers were moved to tears, others never had the opportunity to see the film at all. Southern censors banned Lost Boundaries, claiming that it was a threat to public health and a violation of the laws of segregation. Some black critics cheered at the film's rare dramatic depiction of an intact, refined, upper-middle-class black family, but others fumed at the decision to cast white actors in the Johnstons' roles. Ralph Ellison was perhaps the most vocal critic of Lost Boundaries and other message movies of the late 1940s. To Ellison's mind, pulling black humanity out of the wreckage of the racist epic The Birth of a Nation, 1915, was a tall order. In the struggle against Negro freedom, motion pictures have been one of the strongest instruments for justifying some white Americans' anti-Negro attitudes and practices. An exasperated Ellison argued that rendering whites the true protagonists of the film was an inexcusable affront. Even the advertising for Lost Boundaries directly addressed white audiences and evoked white sympathy by asking, "Would you condemn the Carters for living their lie?" In a critique of Lost Boundaries and other message movies, Ellison observed, "Obviously these films are not about Negroes at all, they are about what whites think and feel about Negroes." By broaching the issue of racial prejudice, Ellison explained, the filmmakers had fallen upon the eggshell ice, but they simply were not heavy enough to break it. The power of the narrative and the effort at exposing racial prejudice was blunted by the hesitation and lack of courage of the directors, resulting in a defeat not only of drama, but of purpose. Perhaps the most troubling scene in Lost Boundaries occurred when Albert Johnston Jr., devastated by the revelation of his black ancestry, traveled to Harlem to gain a better understanding of black people and black culture. The film presents Harlem through a series of terrifying images. Violence and crime erupted on every street corner, and in a frightening dream sequence, Albert Jr.'s mother's pleasing smile suddenly morphed into a frowning and hardened black face. Lost Boundaries presented passing not as a choice, but as a logical strategy to escape the dysfunction and disorder of black life. Albert and Thyra Johnston, on the other hand, recognized the importance of white identification and sympathy, not only to the box office success of Lost Boundaries but also to the film's potential to change racial attitudes. The Johnston family was very satisfied with the production. In a letter to the director, the family wrote, "Lost Boundaries is a perfect portrayal of the emotions and reactions of our family. We congratulate you on producing such a realistic and dramatic presentation of one of America's dilemmas." Still, anticipating a backlash from the black community over the all-white cast, Thyra wrote to express her support of the casting decisions. "Colored folks are very touchy. I say, one thing at a time, and the risk of getting Lost Boundaries filmed at all was quite an undertaking. Had you known of its guaranteed success, No doubt you could have used colored actors, and yet I do think the impact would not have been half so forceful. The production company preempted some protest by strategically casting Canada Lee, a well-known black actor and an outspoken civil rights activist, in a minor yet visible role. Regardless of this last-minute addition to the cast, Thayer's letter and the producer's decisions echoed Gunnar Myrdal's assertions that racial progress was contingent on a combination of white benevolence and white action. Canada Lee parroted Myrdal and other racial liberals when he described the film's greatest asset as its subconscious tug on the heart. The Baltimore Afro-American noted the film's value in making some people think, who are not otherwise easily reached. The Atlanta Daily World praised the film, stating that Lost Boundaries had evoked unanimous praise from hardened critics. The explosive race subject has been presented intelligently and in a manner the most ignorant will approve. A February 1947 editorial in Ebony argued that a legion of decency for Negroes in movies was needed because mammy-minded, plantation-prejudiced movies had done more to disrupt peaceful race relations and set back Negro progress than a fistful of Bilbo speeches in Congress. African-American audience reaction to the film was decidedly mixed. Some laughed at the melodrama and the caricatures of black life in Harlem, whereas others hoped that the film would appeal to the moral conscience of liberal whites, in Myrdalian fashion, and advance the cause of race relations. The film concludes with a sermon that calls for Christian love and forgiveness, that is, of the Johnstons for their sin of racial transgression and not for the long history of racial discrimination that led to the decision to pass and that implicates both the small New Hampshire town and the nation. In keeping with the documentary style of the film, a real clergyman delivers the sermon in a scene shot on location in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, not far from Keene, at a church whose congregants were cast as extras. Ultimately the Johnstons are absolved, but not because their neighbors believe that no real difference separates them. Instead, the racial trespass can be pardoned because the neighbors, just as the newspapers reported, were extraordinarily charitable and public-spirited. Once again, the frame shifts away from the black characters to focus on white charity and benevolence. As the sermon concluded, few churchgoers pondered the actual conditions that animated the practice of passing in the first place. The board of directors of Elliott Community Hospital was not the only group to object to racial passing. In 1949, a film reviewer for Variety predicted the obstacles that Lost Boundaries would face in Southern theaters, noting that the themes portrayed in the film were virtually guaranteed taboos in large sectors of the South. Christine Smith, the city censor in Atlanta, immediately banned Lost Boundaries, stating that it contained inferences throughout which created preachments against long-standing customs that also were part of the laws of the South. Segregation, Smith reminded Northern critics, is a matter of law in the South, not just a matter of prejudice. Lloyd Binford, chairman of the Memphis Board of Censors, bluntly stated, "We don't take that kind of picture here." Binford had a long history of censoring films that he believed clashed with the Southern way of life or offered even the slightest suggestion of the Southern bugbear of social equality. In 1943, he ruled that city and county movie screens could depict blacks only in roles of subservience. During the same year, the Memphis Board of Censors passed a resolution that ordered that no moving picture shall be exhibited in which an all-Negro cast appears or in which roles are depicted by Negro actors or actresses not ordinarily performed by members of the colored race in real life. This ruling rejected even hackneyed portrayals of blacks in musicals such as Cabin in the Sky, 1943. But Lost Boundaries levied a more direct attack on racial inequality and posed twin problems for the censors. The film depicted blacks as professionals, and it displayed a level of interracial interaction and intimacy that vexed even the most liberal Southern audiences. As Walter White noted, the film depicted the Johnstons as what they were, he an excellent and industrious physician, she a superlative housekeeper and church worker, quite different from the prevailing notion of Negroes as stupid, lazy and ignorant. White had argued that improving the representations of blacks in American culture was a key battlefront in the struggle for racial equality. For white racial attitudes to change, blacks must be depicted as rounded, complex, and multidimensional human beings, not flattened, grotesque caricatures. But Binford saw positive portrayals of black life as inimical to the public welfare and bristled at the depiction of social equality between whites and Negroes in a way that we do not have in the South. The specter of social equality haunted Southerners long before Lost Boundaries was released. Small fissures in the Jim Crow system created widespread panic, especially during World War II, when the demands of war mobilization produced new spatial arrangements and placed blacks and whites on the same assembly lines, on the same workbenches, and in the same break rooms and bathrooms in integrated war plants. Southern newspapers charged President Roosevelt's Fair Employment Practices Commission, FEPC, with working to see that Negroes are put in all sorts of positions where they may associate with white men and white women who work in similar capacities, and thus to break down social barriers. Eugene Bull Connor, Commissioner of Public Safety in Birmingham, wrote letters to Roosevelt censuring wartime employment organizations for preaching social equality and stirring up strife. Mississippi Senator and segregationist Theodore Bilba feared that workplace integration would inevitably lead to whites entertaining Negroes and warned against associating with the Negro on equal terms, which would only result in mongrelizing and contaminating the best blood on earth. The post-war period did little to quell Southern anxiety. The interplay of wartime gains, more aggressive demands of the NAACP and other black organizations, and the government's formal commitment to civil rights made it clear that times were changing. When a strong message on civil rights served as the centerpiece of President Truman's 1948 State of the Union address, black leaders lauded the platform as Lincoln-esque and the greatest freedom document since the Emancipation Proclamation. In response, 35 Southern delegates stormed out of the 1948 Democratic Convention, waved Confederate flags, organized the Dixiecrat Party, and nominated Strom Thurmond for president. Contempt for government action still simmered 1 year later when Lost Boundaries was released, and alarm over threats to the racial status quo guided the decisions of Southern censors. Christine Smith argued that Lost Boundaries violated an Atlanta city ordinance that governs the exhibit of pictures which are obscene, lewd, licentious, profane, or will adversely affect the peace, health, morals and good order of the city. Although Smith admitted that the film was not in particular lewd, obscene, licentious or profane, she and the other members of the censorship board voted unanimously to ban the film, arguing that its exhibition would create dissension and strife between the members of the white and colored races, and would be likely to cause disorders, disturbances and clashes between the races. While Smith had approved other films that also dealt with race, she was especially rankled by this film's transparent depictions of the absence of racial segregation and distinguished Lost Boundaries based on its outright pleas for breaking of segregation. Some liberals such as Alexander Miller, director of the Atlanta Anti-Defamation League, supported Smith's ruling. Miller excused Smith's actions by noting that she does have certain laws and regulations which she must follow. Binford also appeared inconsistent when he allowed the Message movie Home of the Brave, 1949, to play in Memphis but rejected Lost Boundaries. Binford read a distinct difference between the two films. Home of the Brave dealt with the association of blacks and whites in the military and the horrors of war. It dramatized interactions and experiences that could happen, implying that the Johnstons' true story could not happen. The Washington Post countered Binford's attempt to deny the actuality of the story and described Lost Boundaries as a real-life drama that was no novel but rather that offered the stark truth, names, places and all. Still, Lost Boundaries would never play in theaters in Memphis or Atlanta. In response to the decision to ban the film in Atlanta, Albert Johnston Jr. wrote a letter to the editor of the Atlanta Constitution and spoke directly to Southerners. "I do not believe Mr. de Rochamont had any intention whatsoever of trying to preach against the traditional Southern ideology of the so-called Negro problem. It is understandable why Miss Christine Smith and the Atlanta Censorship Board at first decided to ban the film. Lost Boundaries is the first major film produced on the social aspect of the Negro problem in the United States, and naturally, it must have been quite difficult, if not impossible, to determine how audiences would react." Albert Jr. soft-pedaled the film's messages to assuage Southern fears about its intent. Theater owners around the country, including those in Southern cities such as New Orleans, Charlotte, Richmond, Miami, and Dallas, reported packed houses when the film was released. Newspapers in New Hampshire heaped praise upon the film and urged every American to see it. Theater owners in some cities reported varying amounts of audience participation, ranging from sincere hissing to equally sincere applause. Critics argued that film producers should not object to receiving negative reactions, but should object to the fact that some audiences are not given a chance to react at all. Has passing passed out? In July 1949, at the weekly luncheon of the New York Press Club, Albert Johnston announced that if given the chance, he would not pass again. 2 years earlier, Johnston had described a deep sense of relief and a great burden lifted from his shoulders after he publicly disclosed his racial background. Johnston was not alone in disavowing passing. During the late 1940s and through the 1960s, the black press published numerous testimonials of African Americans who decided to give up on passing and cataloged the countless psychological advantages of embracing a black identity. Focusing on the collective pride that African Americans experienced when they returned to the race, rather than shame or disadvantage, The testimonials reflected the growing protest spirit and racial affinity of the burgeoning civil rights movement. In the 1950 essay I Refuse to Pass, Janice Kingslow described how she made peace with a decision to retain her dignity by turning down a chance that millions of American girls have dreamed of. Struggling to find work as an actress to support her ailing mother, Kingslow was charged $20 more for rent than her white neighbors. She was personally insulted by white actors who did not want to share the stage with her, and she struggled to find roles other than maids and servants. Presented with a proposal to change her name and pass for white, Kingslow considered the advantages. Then, like a dream of paradise, came the final temptation. If I accepted this offer, I could go anywhere I wanted. I could do anything I wanted, without question. No saleswoman would ever again refuse to sell me a dress. No hotel clerk would refuse me a room. No head waiter would deny me a table. No man would ever look at me again the way that producer had when I told him I was a Negro. The sharp stabs which hurt so much each time they happened would be ended forever. I would be free at last from the unremitting hour-to-hour, day-to-day burden of prejudice. Then, Kingslow considered the sacrifices that passing would entail. This meant stripping my life clear of everything that I was. Conscience wrestled with dreams of fame and money, and conscience won. After negotiating the advantages and disadvantages of passing, Kingslow described her sense of belonging along with a collective identification with the struggles of other African Americans. I myself might escape the burden of prejudice by living a lie. But what about other Negroes? Was I ready to admit I wasn't strong enough to endure what they had to bear? In a reversal of the worry of selling one's birthright for a mess of pottage or choosing the lesser part, Kingslow reiterated the desire of many African Americans to knit spirit and soul together and remain in the race. Black actor Herb Jeffries was presented with a similar yet more elaborate proposition. Jeffries was a superstar among black moviegoers, known as the Bronze Buckaroo. Cowboy star Buck Jones encouraged Jeffries to travel to South America for a year to learn Spanish and later return to the United States as Jones's newly discovered Spanish star. Jeffries told Life magazine, "I was almost tempted because by then I'd learned how things are stacked against you as a Negro. But I suddenly asked myself just what the hell I had to run away from, or be ashamed of. So I turned Buck down." Earlier in Jeffries's career, a movie producer, unaware of his race, offered him a role opposite the white actress Hedy Lamarr. When Jeffries explained that he was a black man, he could not take the role. The movie producer asked incredulously, "Why do you want to be a Negro? You could be anything." Jeffries responded by stating, "I decided some time ago that the Negro people need all the good, intelligent, unbelligerent representatives they can get in this world, and I'm trying to be one." Life praised Jeffries for his honesty and integrity, for scrupulously electing to pass for nothing but what he is, a light-skinned Negro. In the 1950s, journalistic accounts of recrossings of the color line pointed to economic opportunities to explain the end of passing. Jet magazine optimistically predicted that as race barriers fall, the thousands of Negroes who pass to find decent employment will return to their race. The white press, including U.S. News and World Report, also cheerfully announced an era of progress for U.S. Negroes, in which America's nearly 19 million Negroes are making economic progress that would be hard to match anywhere in the world. One article specifically noted advances in professions such as medicine that show increasing numbers of Negroes, twice as many as there were in these fields 18 years ago. In 1944, the Chicago Defender had identified medicine as the most Jim Crowed profession in American life, but by 1950, the American Medical Association passed resolutions urging medical societies to remove racially restrictive membership provisions. During the early 1950s, the Journal of the National Medical Association printed a number of articles that praised the collapse of racial barriers in medical societies and registered efforts to integrate hospitals. Times had changed. Albert Johnston's prospects would have been much brighter had he applied for internships in 1950 rather than in 1928. Ebony and Jet hoped to beckon blacks back into the fold by depicting the economic ascendancy and the social well-being of the black community. The mission of Ebony to create a windbreak that would let blacks get away from the problem for a few moments and say here are some blacks who are making it could easily be repurposed to reacquaint blacks with the material benefits of post-war African American life. The oversized images and overstated successes on the pages of Ebony, excoriated by sociologist E. Franklin Frazier in Black Bourgeoisie, were tailored toward middle and upper middle class blacks, Ebony's target demographic and its advertisers' leading consumers. The achievements of this group, displayed through regular stories that emphasize the first, the only, the best, and their enjoyment of the accoutrements of middle-class status, automobiles, washing machines, and televisions, for example, appeared on the pages of the magazine and enabled readers to see racial progress. The 1952 Jet article "Why Passing is Passing Out" noted, "Most economically sound Negroes who could pass prefer being high-class Negroes to low-class whites." Glossy pictures of blacks attending exquisite society balls, taking expensive vacations, and relaxing in well-appointed homes reminded readers that African Americans were living the good life too. These magazines hoped to offer a convincing argument that the time had come to eschew the false uplift of passing and to participate in more honest forms of class mobility available to African Americans in the post-war period. Post-passing narratives called for a renegotiation and reconciliation with black identity. For some, the end of a racial masquerade meant disentanglement from the psychological burdens of negotiating a divided identity and freedom from the complex and emotionally draining bargaining processes that passing entailed. In "I'm Through with Passing," published anonymously in Ebony in March 1951, the author predicted that although many of her friends would pass without a moment's hesitation just to be free from color problems, poor-paying jobs and all the other vicious injustices that all too often go with being a Negro, she had a different perspective after experiencing the darker side of passing. Listening to white coworkers speak about blacks with bitter contempt, teetering on a state of nervous collapse, and living in constant fear that her secret would be discovered, she felt relieved to be through with passing. No longer did she have to worry about returning coworkers' social invitations or getting sick on the job and being taken home by a coworker who would discover that she lived in a black neighborhood. She could now enjoy a life free from all the hiding, all the dodging, all the miserable lies that turned her life into a confused, frustrated existence. Others, feeling sheepish and dishonest about turning their backs on their people, refused to pass and instead chose to cast their lot with fellow African Americans, come what may. Passing, or racial invisibility, seemed especially incongruous with the upsurge of civil rights activism during this period. The testimonials published in the black press in the 1950s expressed a changing, but not entirely new, sensibility. Its antecedents can be traced to the Reconstruction era, but the desire to live openly, honestly and without deception has been a familiar desire for many racially ambiguous people. The salience of changing material conditions, if only rhetorically, should not be discounted, but it must be noted that something more transformative was also at work. Making history and a race. During the 1960s, racial politics had changed course once again. Black identities were affirmed and passing was rejected. Black was beautiful. Large afros were in, chemically straightened hair was out. The chant of black power, the surge of black pride and black unity, and the revival of black nationalist movements rendered passing dissonant with the times. Blending in with the white world seemed no longer economically necessary, politically advantageous, or socially desirable. Attention shifted to black history and black art. In 1968, the Chicago Defender created a contest called How to Build Black Pride that invited readers to submit ideas about how to increase self-respect and self-love in the black community. Readers recommended the eradication of the white image from the thoughts and actions of black people. Black parents were charged with bequeathing black pride to their children. In an urgent appeal for authenticity, the Defender's readership suggested that the damage done by the hegemonic white image could be reversed by simply being ourselves. To be sure, passing continued, just as it had in every previous era. But in this racial climate, passing was no longer discussed in magazines, no longer the subject of popular films, no longer an above-the-fold story in the New York Times or the Atlanta Daily World. The racial winds had shifted. By the 1970s, many African Americans perceived passing as either a relic of the past or the worst form of racial treachery. Rather than asking if passing passed out, more specific questions should be posed about how the confluence of the political, social, and economic currents of the post-war era guided the decisions that light-skinned blacks made about their racial identities. Many chose to opt out of passing, once home. Some enjoyed greater economic opportunities because of a booming post-war economy, but most delighted in the pleasure of racial fellowship and the freedom from the anxiety of being discovered. Others, like actor Herb Jeffries, spoke of accepting individual inconveniences in order to closely align themselves with the larger struggles of African Americans. Although this is a recurrent historical theme, early in the century we heard the ex-colored man lament in 1912 that he had chosen the lesser part and had failed to devote himself to work so glorious as that of Booker T. Washington and others who were making history and a race. These concerns were amplified in the context of the mid-century civil rights movement. The dichotomy of getting ahead versus making history posed by film scholar J. Ronald Green in his discussion of the filmic style of passing juxtaposes the painful trade-offs that passing required with its assurance of economic gain. Getting ahead, as many of the examples of working as white indicated, was both the most obvious and the most morally justifiable reason for passing. Making history was a much more rigorous pursuit, open only to those who identified as black. It was far too risky to make history while passing. Few who passed would invite the kind of scrutiny that becoming famous demanded. During the civil rights movement, one did not have to be a race leader to make history as new potentialities emerged for the heroic involvement of everyday people. At that moment, passing struck the wrong notes and had too many hallmarks of false advancement. Similar to the Reconstruction era, when to be black was to be somebody, whereas to be white was to be nobody, the post-war years marked an analogously transformative age when passing as white meant confinement to a non-transformative role. As J. Ronald Green argues, that choice also bypasses the mission of one's group, and in that sense, it is to pass out of history. Passing out of history had been desirable at times. Ellen Craft and countless other racially ambiguous runaway slaves hoped to pass out of the history of slavery, and years later, Lieutenant William J. French hoped to pass out of the constraints of life under Jim Crow. But this was no longer a legitimate or logical desire in the post-war period. Not at a time when it was clear that history was about to be made.